Hey everybody, welcome to the Boxscore Geeks show. We've got another interesting show for you this week. It's going to be a bit of a one-man show because my partners Arturo Galetti and Trey Alvarez couldn't join us this week. But we're going to hear some input from our lovely and talented producer, Brian Foster. Why don't you go ahead and say hi, Brian?
Well, I don't know how talented I am, but thanks for calling me lovely. I really appreciate that.
Well, it's really hard for our viewers to say because you never show your picture on the podcast. So I'm sure there's a lot of curiosity out there about what our talented and lovely producer looks like.
No, that's a good point. Although I was on air for 3 hours during the draft broadcast, but yeah, one of
Oh,
these
that's
days.
right. We saw you in the draft podcast.
Oh,
Just a little
absolutely.
peek behind the curtain for the
No,
viewers.
see, we planned to have all three of us, or all three of you guys here on the show today, but we couldn't work it out. So my camera's not set up. We're just going with you, Patrick.
Okay, it's just me, so I apologize to everybody who was looking forward to Dre's sultry radio voice. And we're gonna get started. We're gonna talk about some interesting things. I think the first thing we want to talk about is the judge's ruling in the O'Bannon trial, which I don't know how many people. Well, probably most of the people following this podcast know exactly what happened, which was that a judge in the U.S. District Supreme Court of what was it? It was in L.A. or in California, I think.
That would make the
Correct me if
most
I'm wrong.
sense. That's where UCLA
Yeah.
is, but I'm not. I don't fully
Anyway,
know.
the judge basically told the NCAA, basically said, "Piss off with your amateur stuff. You guys are not in the NCAA players are not amateurs. You don't treat them like amateurs. I don't buy into that stuff." It's got a lot of really interesting ramifications. The gist of it, though, is that it was like a 50 or 60 page ruling. The gist of it is probably that nothing's going to happen for a while because these things take months and months and months to actually turn into actual consequences in practice, even if the law changes immediately. I think that the interesting thing I wanted to talk about today, though, is that there was a pretty cool article on the Wages of Wins today about an interview between Bob Bowlesby, who is the Big 12 commissioner, and ESPN Radio. And Bob Bowlesby went ahead and just straight up quoted Marx and said, if you apply any form of the labor theory of value, that is to say that work that goes into something is determinant of the cost, football and basketball players don't work any harder than any other athletes. And therefore, they shouldn't get paid because, we're not going to pay, college gymnasts and we're not going to play lacrosse players. So why should we play football and basketball players? And of course, to the delight of lots of folks, the ESPN commentators passed on a question from Jay Bilas, who asked Mr. Bowlesby if he works any harder than his secretary and whether or not he should be making 60 times what his secretary does. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, Bob Bowlesby, who claims to be in charge of a nonprofit organization, the Big 12, earns $1.8 million a year as its commissioner. So, I mean, I thought that was pretty interesting stuff. Basically, you got a guy who's earning $1.8 million a year arguing for a Marxist system where the players shouldn't get paid any because they don't work any harder than any of the other athletes. What do you think about that, Brian?
No, this is great stuff. Two great pieces on Wages of Wins by Jonathan Weiler this week about, the ruling. And we've had him on this show before to talk about the trial that was ongoing. And, I highly recommend his stuff. He's got some interesting takes on it.
Yeah, I think my only real takeaway from this is what's interesting is that when you talk to the stakeholders, the people who actually cash in on the money, I mean, the common thing that almost every school says is the athletic programs don't make money. And David Barry at the Wages of Wins and Arturo and I and Dre, our response to that is always 100% always is, I don't give a shit what your book says. If you're not making any money, why is your football coach the highest paid public employee in your state? I think that's true. 49 out of 50 states, the highest paid public employee is a football coach at a major college, and I think the 50th, the highest paid, is a basketball coach. I think that's Mike Krzyzewski, but I'm not certain. Don't quote me on that. But it's amazingly, football coaches are the highest paid public employees at like every state, and that's just the public colleges. There's a few private ones who I'm sure pay their football coaches and basketball coaches lots of money too. And it goes not just the coaches, but all the way up to the people in charge, like Mr. Polsby, who earns a staggering $1.8 million salary. I'm pretty sure you can't find a lot of CEOs of very many nonprofit corporations that make $2 million a year. And it's interesting that the other thing is that anytime anybody brings up the idea of paying college students to play football, it's always, oh, it'll be the end of college football. College football will have to close down because the alternative to that, of course, is that, oh, well, we'll have to stop paying me $1.8 million. And since we all know that's not going to happen, we're just going to shut down college football entirely if that ever happens. So I'd like to know, actually, from the listeners, from the viewers, sorry, do you guys think college football would really end if they started paying student athletes, 30, 40, $50,000 a year? Or do you think it's more likely that schools would stop paying their coaches $2 million a year and start paying, for better players if they wanted to be good and not paying very much if they don't want to be very good? And we'd end up with pretty much the exact system of parity that we have now, and the system of parity that we have now is such that the schools that spend a shitload of money on their football programs have really good football programs, and the schools that don't spend a lot of money on the football programs generally suck and get pounded on every year, 43-0 by teams like Boise State and the University of Texas, etc. I don't know. What do you think about that, Brian?
No, absolutely, and I've got the Deadspin, graphic up right now that has all those highest paid coaches per state, and yeah, they almost all are football coaches. There are a few basketball coaches, or if you live in Nevada, the med school plastic surgeon, I guess, is the highest. But no, it's
Oh, really?
true.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. There are a few other med school deans as well. Yeah, check out that graphic; it's entertaining. But no, I
Okay.
mean that fun graphics aside. I think the point that was made in the
I'm
article.
pretty sure I
go
didn't
ahead.
pull this one out of my ass, and I'm pretty sure at one point in time, a couple years ago, and I don't think it came from Deadspin. I think it came from an article that Dre did, or maybe David Barry. I'm not sure. Where we discovered that 49 out of 50 states had their highest paid public employee was an athletic coach or athletic director somewhere.
Wouldn't
But
be surprised to hear that. But here's the
and we
great point.
we may have used different measuring sticks about who's a public employee and stuff like that. So
What
but
is public? Who knows?
yeah, I mean, yeah. What does not for profit mean? Because I'm pretty sure it's not the Big 12. Sure looks to me like the Big 12 is making a lot of profit.
Here's the best point that was made. I think it was in that article, maybe another one, but basically, look, before college football was this massive billion-dollar industry, Division I college football still existed. Division II and III still exist today, and I'm not sure how healthy it is, but it exists. So I don't think this would collapse the system.
Yeah, I mean, I bet you if you went into the typical Division II, Division III school, I wouldn't be surprised if the football coach makes a heck of a lot more money than the average professor anywhere else. But
Absolutely,
yeah,
because even the scale is what's crazy, right? Even if these guys, make some money, if the coaches and, conference guys and all that, like you're talking about, make just a little bit less, that would be enough to pay the players.
Well, what I think is really interesting is that the NCAA is, I think for obvious reasons, because they're very worried about any of that precious money that the coaches and the athletic directors get. They're worried about any of it disappearing anywhere else. But the NCAA doesn't even let athletes make money out of their name I mean, the whole reason this started is O'Bannon said, well, what the hell? My picture is on the cover of, I think it was, what was it, NCAA 2K2 or whatever the sports game was. There was an EA sports game.
Yeah.
And he was on the cover of it. And he was like, well, how come I don't get any money from that? That's my picture. That's me. That's not the college I played for. That's me. And I think that the NCAA has all these really crazy rules. Like, well, you can't even hold a part-time job, working at the McDonald's if you're playing in college, because in theory, the NCAA will say, well, we're already paying you because we're giving you this free education. Doesn't matter if you don't have enough money to ever fly home. Doesn't matter if you don't have any pocket change to go watch a movie. God forbid you take a part-time job and earn a little bit more cash than, whatever crazy stupid tiny stipend we give you per month for expenses. It's just kind of insane. And the fact that the NCAA doesn't loosen up that, because I would imagine if you were a player like, say, Andrew Wiggins last year, you'd have been perfectly fine playing, free basketball for Kansas all year long as you're willing to cash in on a $9 million a year deal with Nike or whatever it is he could have gotten a year earlier than he did once he turned pro.
That's one of Dave Barry's, favorite points of mine that he makes is that, he's a college professor himself, and he hires students to do work for him, students that are getting scholarships already. He hires someone to grade his papers, and it works out great. That student gets some money, but
Right.
yet he couldn't hire a football player to grade his papers if he wanted, or he couldn't even hire the football player to play football.
Yeah, and I think the reason is because the NCAA is trying desperately hard to cling to this illusion that the scholarship really is enough, that they really are paying more than a fair price for the football player's services by giving them a free ride. And if they were to start letting players earn money, it would be like a tacit admission of, yeah, well, I guess it's true. What we're giving you isn't really enough to live on. You got to work aside from this. And then that totally opens the floodgates to the argument of saying, well, I guess that free ride you're giving them isn't actually really a fair compensation now, is it? But anyway, so I mean, that's really about all I have to say to the O'Bannon trial. I think that in the coming months, we're going to see some really interesting things start to happen. I knew a guy that worked at that went to Northwestern and played ball at Northwestern, and I tried to get him on the show, but he didn't want to come on the show and talk about the NCAA or his former teammates or anything. And I think because there was a pretty interesting ruling in Northwestern along these lines a few months ago that ruled that the athletes there are in fact employees and not just random student amateur athletes. All right, so let's move on. I think the next thing we wanted to talk about is just a little bit of an aside. I think that a lot of the readers of the blog have figured this out. We're getting a little bit more aggressive with our comment policy. We're just starting to delete comments that we think don't make any sense. We're getting a little bit tired of repeating the same arguments over and over again and having people who haven't actually read the books or our articles or our methodology or the facts on how things work make blatantly false claims about how our statistics work. And rather than every time that happens, me having to go in and type a comment for all the other readers that says, no, what you just said is completely and totally wrong, go back and read the fucking manual. Instead of doing that, we're just going to basically start deleting posts that violate that rules. And to anyone that's going to scream censorship, I'm going to say right here, yep, you are totally right. It is blatant, complete and utter fascist censorship. And if you don't like it, go buy your own blog. I don't know. Got anything to add to that, Brian? Do you feel like I'm unjustly punishing any of the commenters?
No, not too much. Although I will ask one question. One of the commenters mentioned something. Maybe all those comments could get archived somewhere so they weren't interrupting the thread, but at the same time were not actually censored. And you seem to agree. So I don't know if something like that could happen.
Yeah, well, I think that mostly what I'm going to do is just, I will put probably something slightly more amusing than a sentence that says this comment was deleted by the administrator. So that, if somebody replies to a stupid comment, then at least people later can see, oh, he replied to a stupid comment and now the stupid comment's gone. I get it. And then the thread can move on. I mean, I think it kind of like a Reddit style thing where sometimes, posts, usually what happens in Reddit is posts get downloaded so much, and then whoever wrote the post that has negative 400 points or whatever decides, wow, that's really fucking embarrassing, and deletes his own post. But rather than doing it that way, we're just going to delete it for you and save you some effort.
No, I don't have too much to say about this. Overall on the internet, there's all different kinds of websites. They have all different kinds of comment policies that serve different purposes.
Yeah. And we don't want to be YouTube, where most of the comments are completely worthless. So I'm going to just simply, not just I, but Dre and Arturo as well, we're just going to exercise our editorial powers and decide which comments actually contribute to discussions and which ones don't. And I'm fine with people that disagree with some methodology, but if you just say shit that's totally wrong, just going to nuke you. Not really worth my time.
Yeah, and there's plenty of posters that do disagree with comments all the time, and we welcome those posters because they disagree in a constructive way.
Yeah, well, yeah, Yeah, it's not just being constructive, although it's part of it. I think it's just a blatant like falsehood of some of the comments. You know, I see people
Right.
somebody wrote in an article the other day. Somebody wrote that adding in that the team adjustment in wins produce formula is the same as adding the error term back in, and I'm like, no, it's not. Go reread it. And I was in the middle of saying that when I decided, you know what, I don't have time to keep saying this over and over again. That's not what that does, and I don't want new readers to be confused and think that's what it does. So I'm just going to delete it because that's just not true.
And that's what it comes down
And you
to in
know,
the
and
end, right?
yeah, yeah.
It would be
It's if you
great if we had time to argue with every single person over and over again, but we don't. It's just simpler
Yeah,
to do
well,
it
I
this
like
way.
to look at it as, you know, being the professor in a classroom, and if somebody raised their hand and said something that literally was false, like the textbook said something different, but the person raised their hand and said the textbook says X when the textbook really says Y, I'm going to react just like the professor and say, no, it doesn't. Read it again. Let's move on. And not distract the rest of the class with a ridiculous argument about why what he said is false. Anyway, that was a little bit more than we needed to talk about in the podcast because that's not a very entertaining subject. Um, let's talk about two players that have piqued my interest this year purely from an economic, well, actually, not so much an economics perspective, but a finance perspective. And those two players are Eric Bledsoe and Greg Monroe. Now, I think the Eric Bledsoe situation is still in flux, but rumor has it, I keep hearing the rumor anyway on Twitter, that Bledsoe is considering taking the qualifying offer because he's basically pissed off and feels like he's worth a max contract, but Phoenix is only offering him, supposedly, again, this is all rumor, 4 years and at 12 million apiece. So I think it was 4 years, 48 million. Greg Monroe, interestingly enough, I saw Greg Monroe tweet himself. Like somebody, one of his fans, you know, basically called him a douchebag and said, why aren't you taking the 4 year, $50 million offer that Detroit gave you?" And Greg said, "Well, I can't take an offer that no one's given me." So again, we don't know what's actually happened, but at least it seems like Greg Monroe is implying that the Detroit Pistons have not given him any decent offers at all. Um, I don't know what offers they might have, but 4 years, 50 million sounds like about what almost any other team would pay for Greg Monroe's services. So if they haven't offered him that much, then yeah, that's a pretty lowball offer. But supposedly, Greg Monroe is now taking the qualifying option, which means he's going to play for $5.7 million this year and become a restricted free agent at the end of next year. Um, and I've heard all kinds of rumors that Eric Bledsoe is considering doing the same thing because he's not happy with 4 years and 48 million. He thinks he's worth a max contract, which I think in the current CBA would be about 4 years and $60 million. Or maybe actually a little more because I think it's 16 is the max, so it'd be like $64 million, right? And here's where it gets interesting. I did a little calculation on how much money Eric Bledsoe would be losing and or winning by opting to take the qualifying offer, playing out the season, become a restricted free agent, and then in theory get a max offer next summer because next summer the other teams aren't going to be thinking, well, they'll match anyway. I can just, in other words, next summer in theory, he is able to get a max contract because there's going to be 3, 4 teams that are willing to give him a max contract, and Phoenix won't be able to just match any offer and scare away other suitors that way. So I don't know. Should we talk for a second about what net present value means, or do we all understand that? What do you think, Brian? Do you know what net present value is?
I think we should talk about it.
Okay, so the idea of net present value, it's pretty simple actually. If I came to you and said, Brian, would you like $1 million now, or would you like me to give you $100,000 per year for the next 10 years? What would your answer be? Class? Anybody? Bueller? Bueller?
Oh well, I was actually producing, so I wasn't paying attention to the question. But
Sorry,
I'm
I
sure,
didn't mean to interrupt your
like many
job.
people, I would get it blatantly wrong. But I do have the Wikipedia definition of net present value up on screen right now.
Okay, but let's do this pedantic little exercise here.
Okay, I'm ready.
Which
I'm
would you
ready.
rather have? $1 million now or $100,000 a year per year for 10 years?
Oh, you always take the million up front.
Why?
Well, because you can invest it, make some interest, the net present value.
Yeah, so if you put $1 million in a bank account right now and you spent And let's say you could get 5% on your money somehow, because usually if you have $1 million, you're going to get a better interest rate than if you just put it on a money market fund or something like that, right? You can invest it in bonds or something. You could probably get 5% a year. Then after 10 years, this is worth a lot more money than, if you did the same thing with $100,000 every year because of compound interest.
Exactly.
Right. And so that I think that's a pretty easy one that everybody understands, but it gets complicated because if I were to say to you, Ryan, I would say you can have $1 million now, or you can have $100,000 a year for 9 years, and then in year 10, I'll give you $300,000. What do you say then?
I'd say, well, I get time for to go to the spreadsheet.
Okay, yeah, and that's the easy way, right? But it gets way more complicated if I start throwing out crazy fractions, and I'll give you 90,000 in year one, and I'll give you 120,000 in year two, and I'll give you 130,000. And the math gets really complicated really quick, right? So the idea of net present value is that a very smart finance guy sometime somewhere just sat down and did the math and figured out what the value of a series of payments distributed throughout the future would be worth in today's dollars. So, and it usually involves a couple of assumptions, one of which is the discount rate, which is a fancy way of saying that's how much money you could earn as interest on whatever you have now. That's the discount rate. And the other is exactly, how much the payments are. Those are the two assumptions. So for Eric Bledsoe, and you can do this in Excel, by the way, there's an actual NPV function in Excel. So I don't really need to walk you through the math. You can totally do this yourself if you want to. But I took the assumption with Eric Bledsoe. I said, let's say he plays for the qualifying offer, which in Eric Bledsoe's case is only $3.7 million. And then let's ignore injury for the moment. And let's also assume the best case scenarios possible for Eric Bledsoe. Let's assume that he gets, after that qualifying year, in next year, in the 2015 offseason, he'd get a 4-year max contract, which is about, and this is where the math gets fuzzy because you never know exactly what a max contract is worth, because max contracts numbers are not like fixed numbers. It's not like 16 million is the max. Rather, max contracts are a certain percentage of the salary cap, which is calculated anew every season. So it's always really hard to say exactly how much it is, but we can ballpark it. We can say it's going to be 16 million a year. So let's assume Bledsoe plays for 3.7 million next year, then signs a 4-year, $64 million contract, which would pay him through the 18-19 season. Then when that contract is up, let's assume that he'd get another 4-year max deal. And let's assume because I don't know if we've talked about this before, but the salary cap is probably going to balloon after the 16-17 season because of the big TV contract that the NBA is going to sign that year. The maximum salary is probably going to go way up. So let's assume, Bledsoe's still an all-star, and he signs another 4-year max contract through the 22-23 season, and I'm assuming that's going to be $24 million a year, right? So this is his best case scenario. Never gets hurt, plays for 3.7 million, then 4 years, 64 million, and then 4 years, 96 million after that, right? That's the scenario of the qualifying offer. Now we take the scenario where he takes Phoenix's 4-year, $48 million offer now. And that would expire after the 17-18 season. Then we assume he can get that 4-year, $24 million a year contract, the same one he would have gotten in the first scenario. Are you following me so far? Am I losing you? And then that's 4 years, 96 million. That pays him through the 21-22 season. And then we assume, because he's going to be about 29 or 30 in 21-22, we assume he's still good enough to get at least 12 million in the 22-23 season, which is the season that would have been the last season of his big 4-year, $96 million offer in scenario one, right? So in other words, we've just plugged in numbers for what his potential salary is all the way through 22-23. And in one scenario, he takes the restricted free agent offer that's on his table right now. And in the other, he takes the qualifying offer, 3.7 million, and then gets a much bigger salary later. Okay, off the top of your head, Ryan, what do you think the difference is between these two in net present value?
Well, since I was paying attention for about half of that, I have no clue. But I
Okay,
have to.
I mean, it's a bit
Overall,
complicated.
what you're saying is right. You have to time these contracts, and the the new TV contract the NBA is signing is so important. The LeBron James deal, kind of spelled that out to everyone. Everyone saw LeBron's 2-year deal. They know that that's what players are gunning for.
Right, and it can get more complicated because maybe we assume Bledsoe only takes the qualifying offer. Then after that, he only takes a 1-year deal like LeBron, so that he's a free agent in 16, 17 after the salary cap balloons, and then maybe he gets a bigger contract then, right? But I kind of glossed over that. I assume maybe he wants security, a little more money, 4 years max, and then 4 years max again, right?
Sure, but we're ready for the reveal now.
Okay.
Let's hear it.
The reveal is if he takes the qualifying offer, the net present value of all those future contracts is $124 million. Meaning, if I gave him $124 million now and said, okay, but you don't get to keep any of your salary in the future, it'd be about the same amount of money, right? If he instead takes Phoenix's offer, plays for 4 years, $48 million, and then signs a big contract after that, the net present value of all those future contracts is $120 million, $4 million less. In other words, that big $8 million difference next year, because he has to play for $3.7 million instead of $12 million, it takes a long, long time for that to pay off because, that's $8 million you can't invest now. You're waiting until later to get those $8 million. And it takes a long time to pay off, and the difference is small. It's only $4 million. Now, what we've done here is we've been talking best case scenario, and B, we've been completely ignoring injury, which, if you don't mind my saying so, in Eric Bledsoe's case is madness. Eric Bledsoe has been injured a lot, and I think Eric Bledsoe should really be worried about whether or not he'd injure himself in this year where he's playing for the qualifying offer. It could all work out well, and he could get a big contract, but it could all end terribly tragically in a Paul George-esque manner and be, a potentially catastrophic, huge, $50 million mistake for him to take this qualifying offer. I know what most financial planners would say. They would say, you're young, you got like 8 earning years, you're crazy, don't pay for $3.7 million, take that offer that's on the table right now. I'm not really sure what he's thinking, how confident he is in his health, but to play for the qualifying offer is a huge, huge financial risk. It's basically not a big bonus in terms of overall pay, and it's really, really risky. And I think I'm thinking the same thing about Greg Monroe right now, but in his case, it's much, much harder to do the math because we have no realistic idea of what contract may or may not have been offered to Greg Monroe. What is he turning down? I mean, if they're only offering him $8 million a year, he's probably pretty safe taking that $5.7 million qualifying offer because he'll probably get a lot more than that once it's up. Any thoughts on this? Have I confused the classroom, Brian?
No, it does make some sense, and I think overall longer-term contracts, it is easy to see why they can be bad for good players and good for bad players, right? It makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I mean, personally, I think in Eric Bledsoe's case, so the problem with the LeBron situation, right? LeBron is timing his contracts to coincide with that big increase in the salary cap. The problem is that most players don't have the leverage to do this. And the problem is going to be twofold for them. The first problem is that LeBron's not the only superstar that's going to do this. I'd bet very large amounts of money that Kevin Love is going to follow suit. I'm sure lots of other players. I'm sure Durant is going to follow suit. I think Durant's contract is up in the same year anyway. Basically, anybody that's like, first or second or third team NBA, all NBA caliber player, and whose contract expires around that time anyway, is going to, or expires even next year, is not going to renew for like 4 or 5 years unless they're so old, like for example Chris Bosh, that the security of that 5-year max contract is worth so much to them because they know in years 4 and 5 they're not going to be that good players anymore.
Question for you specifically about Bledsoe. Is there any research saying that guards will decline sooner than big men because they need more speed, or is that just kind of NBA conjecture?
I think there's a lot of conjecture here. I think that the general consensus is there are certain things that deteriorate more slowly than others. I think big men generally do hold out longer because a lot of what they do isn't necessarily dependent on athletics, and it might be more dependent on skill. Um, I mean, if you're a big man, the skill of boxing out, the skill of your low post footwork, etc., that kind of stuff tends to hold through longer. But you do definitely see declines in big men, and some of what big men do is actually very athletic dependent, like offensive rebounding. Um, but I think what the main thing is that players like so I'd be very, very nervous about Derrick Rose right now. Players who are dependent on their athleticism to get layups, to shoot efficiently, to get to the basket, they are obviously going to decline with age because that's the kind of thing that they're going to be less and less able to do to get that first step beyond a defender who's much younger than them. It gets harder and harder and harder to do. Players like Steve Nash, whose game is dependent much more on shooting efficiency. Like he's one of the people forget about Nash. He's one of the greatest 3-point shooters of all time. So even at the age of 38, 39, however old he was before all the really nasty injuries started, he was still able to get by people. He was still able to shoot lots of extremely efficient shots. He had all the old man at the Y tricks in his backpack.
We've all played against that guy.
We've all played against that guy, and Steve Nash was an incredibly efficient shooter and passer, and those are two things that tend to stay with you longer, right? I mean, it's been working for Ray Allen, it's working for Kyle Korver, it worked for Steve Nash for a long time.
Chauncey Billups.
Chauncey Billups was very efficient for a very long time, whereas if you look back at players who needed their athleticism, and not just recently, but you go way back, Isaiah Thomas got bad a lot sooner than, for example, Magic Johnson did. Kevin Johnson didn't last quite as long as guys like John Stockton did, etc. You can find a lot of guys, and Jason Kidd's another example. He never relied very much on his shooting anyway. It was his extremely efficient passing and his defensive rebounding that made him so good, and the fact that he didn't turn the ball over.
And the big man counterexample, I remember when Sabonis finally made it to the NBA. I'm not sure, but I thought it was some pretty good numbers he was putting up, and at that point he was totally broken down physically. He was known in the 80s as being one of the most athletic big men of all time, but he was still good in the NBA despite that physical problem.
Yeah, I mean, and his game, again, it's obvious that his game did not rely on athleticism. His game relied on he obviously had amazing hands, which let him grab lots of contested rebounds, and which made him a great passer and a great shooter. Those are the things that made him good, right? And it's one of the things that makes Kevin Love. Again, I hate harping on the Kevin Love not being a great athlete thing, but it's kind of true. The reason Kevin Love is great is because he has great hands, and he's a great shooter, and he's a good passer. The great hands make him a great rebounder. I mean, guys, if you're Cleveland fans, oh my God, you're gonna love this. Watching Kevin Love rebound is amazing because it's just balls where it's just he gets the tippity tip of his finger on it, and it's like fucking glue. And he just has those big mitts. He grabs that rebound, and that's also what makes him a great full court passer. And I'm pretty sure that strength and touch in his hands is what gives him a great 3-point shot, and that opens up lots of opportunities for you on the offense. I mean, if you don't shoot very well, like for example, Derrick Rose, you have to have an extremely good first step to get by people, which at least until his injuries, Derrick Rose didn't have any problem with. He was like, no problem. I can't shoot, but holy shit, I'm fast. John Wall discovering the same kind of thing, right? But as you get older and you're not as fast, you have to be able to shoot because once you can shoot, defenders have to come so close to you. They have to respect that shot so much that it becomes easier to get around them, even if you're not that fast. And it's just kind of logic. It's really hard to do like an empirical study on this. But we have done some data munging that suggests that things like shooting efficiency and assist to turnover ratio tend to not decline as much with time. But things like steals, offensive rebounds, block shots, those deteriorate a lot with time. And then eventually the shooting efficiency always starts to go down because eventually you get to the point where you're just not fast enough to get, the easy shots that you used to get. You don't get the layups that you used to get, et cetera, right? And then you get to that point where every shot is a hard contested shot.
That was my point from the beginning, but, that's how you have to do it sometimes when you're short. Anything more on these two guys and the contracts situation in the NBA right now?
No, I'll be happy to publish my math in a couple days, but all I would say is that, if I think if you look at this from a finance perspective, and this is one of the reasons that restricted agency has the players just so over a barrel, it's usually not in the player's selfish best interest to turn down an offer, even if it's a lowball offer. So, um, the keys to the keys to restricted free agency is get in early, get one of the teams that has money to give you max money, make your team match it, because there aren't very many teams that have that money available, and once they're gone, suddenly all your leverage is gone too. Um, okay, you got anything else to say about that? You got any comments on that?
No, actually, I'm ready for the next segment. I'll
Okay,
give a little tease and
you're
say
just a little too excited about this segment. I
I
think.
am. I could say this is my favorite segment in the history of the show. Maybe that's how excited I am. So
Yeah,
go
that's
ahead,
a
Patrick.
oversell because all this really is we got some upcoming features on Boxscore Geeks. We're gonna have some pretty cool stuff. I'm not gonna give you guys any firm dates, but I am gonna say this is all gonna happen before the next season starts. So I'll even try and go for before the preseason starts. So by October 1st, the latest. Some of this stuff is coming earlier than other stuff, but we have some really cool features coming up. That's one of the reasons I haven't been writing a lot of articles this week. I apologize for the lack of daily content lately, but Dre has moved and Arturo has moved. He's starting a new job, and I am furiously writing code. I'm furiously hacking away. So some of the upcoming features we have on Boxscore Geeks. The first one is one that I get probably two people a week asking me about this to the point that they've stopped asking because I probably haven't been very responsive about this. But we're going to get historical numbers. We're going to get historical wins produced data going back to 1978 for sure. And then we're probably going to get some stuff going back to 1974. But we're going to definitely have everything we can get back to 1978.
And now
I
for the
think
viewers, that's the year when the NBA started keeping all the stats, right? On turnovers, blocks, things like that.
Yeah, so 78 is what we call the turnover era, and 74, I believe, is when block shots started being recorded.
Something like that, yeah.
Because I think I remember looking into this, and block shots, and I remember the irony, the bitter irony, block shots became an official stat the year after Wilt Chamberlain retired, which, because I would really love to know how many shots did Wilt Chamberlain block a game? Because like if you said Wilt Chamberlain blocked 7 shots a game, would you be like, yeah, I believe that?
I believe just about anything about Wilt Chamberlain. If
I mean,
if the number weren't 20,000, it were for 50,000,
yeah.
100,000, maybe I'd even believe him on that.
I mean, it's obviously so hard to do comparisons, and it's really hard to do the classic comparison of who was better, Wilter or Shaq, or those kinds of crazy comparisons are hard to do anyway because of people's legitimate points that the league was different, right? I mean, the difference physically between Wilt and the players he was playing against was massively different
Wilt
than.
actually looks like a modern NBA player back then when he was playing, and no one else did.
Yeah, exactly. Wilt looks like, if Wilt were like, even if he had poor stats, Wilt would be like in college, he'd be like Andre Drummond, where people would be saying, yeah, I'm taking that guy with a very high pick because holy cow, he's got an NBA body, right? But he was obviously compared to Shaq, kind of a skinny dude, right? The thing is,
Exactly.
I think people sort of overstated this because a lot of people say, well, it's not fair because Wilt was like, a giant among men. I think a lot of those people never really looked closely at how much massively bigger Shaq was than everybody else in his third or fourth year, because it was crazy how much of a mountain of a man Shaq was compared to the other. He was playing against guys like Rick Smits. Come on.
No, in my lifetime, I can only think of two instances where a player was so good that there was clamor to change the rules of the game. The first was Barry Bonds, of course, and the intentional walks. But yeah, Shaq is the other one. He was just so good that people didn't want him to get hacked.
Yeah, and it was crazy. But anyway, I'm very upset that blocks weren't recorded until 74 because I bet the sort of Batman versus Superman arguments that we could have would be a lot more interesting if we had block and turnover data. Because if I had to take a wild guess, And again, I have no data to back this up, but I've had to take a wild guess. Bill Russell, for example, would be very low in turnovers and crazy high in blocks, which would make him like pretty much the best defensive big man of all time. Um, and then I'm not even sure if they did they. I'm not even sure that. Yeah, they recorded assists. They had assists in the 60s and 70s, but um, yeah. So anyway, 78 is what we call the turnover era. That's when they started recording, and that's when wins produced starts to get very interesting because turnovers are such a big deal, right? That it's really hard to say what wins produced data would be without having turnover data because you could have a guy that maybe shot really efficiently, but maybe he turned the ball over 8 times a game and he was terrible. It's really hard to say. Um, Okay, so we're gonna have data back to 1978, and my only initial preview about that is, holy shit, Wes Unseld was good. Whew. Um, and then we're gonna have some JavaScript tools we're gonna have to play around with. So I've been looking a lot at what we talk about a lot about the website 538, right? We've been talking a lot about them recently because we think their statistics are a bit of a black box, and we get I hear a lot about NBA plus minus, which is a stat I'm already thoroughly unimpressed by. But what 538 does do a good job with is coming out with tables on pretty short notice from one day to the next saying, oh, here's a quick table I whipped up that tells you how many wins we think Kevin Love will make to the Cleveland Cavaliers. And I'm going to have tables like that for us. And I'm also going to have JavaScript tools that'll let you play around with it. Because if you look at it and you're like, well, Patrick, you're full of shit. Kevin Love's never going to play as many minutes. I'd like to downgrade that by 400 minutes and see what that changes. You can do that, or you can even do things like saying, well, I don't think Kevin Love's going to play power forward. I bet they're going to play small ball, and he's going to run him out at the center. How does that change things? And you get to change the things, and you get to see how that would tweak and change the projections, the win projections of each player, and consequently of any particular team. And because a lot of what this boils down to is a lot of our predictions are pretty far off. And one of the reasons they're pretty far off is because it's really hard to predict minutes by position, injury, and in general lineups. So it's really hard to say, who's the coach going to play? Because I know if I were running the Cavaliers, I know who I'd play, and I'm pretty sure Deion Waiters would never see the floor. However, I don't think that's going to happen when David Blatt takes over. I strongly suspect Deion Waiters is going to get a lot of minutes, but who knows? Maybe Blatt's a little smarter than we give him credit for, and maybe LeBron will be. What it all boils down to is LeBron on the coach's side, because if LeBron is on the coach's side, then he gets to do whatever the hell he wants, and if LeBron isn't on his side, then he has to play a little office politics in the locker room, right? So anyway, predictions are really hard because even if we were to accurately predict each player's performance, which is in itself kind of hard, performance is fairly solid from year to year, but I think a lot of people reading the blog have a very flawed understanding of what fairly solid means and how big variance is, even when things have a correlation of, say, zero 0.8 from year to year. So given that how hard those things are, I'm going to let you play around with things and make your own predictions and say, here's what I think is going to happen because I think these players are going to play these many minutes at these positions, and I think their performance is going to be more like this. What that all boils down to is you're going to probably be able to make the table say whatever the hell you want them to say. But at least it'll be something for you guys to play around with, give you a little more insight into how our data is actually compiled. If you're interested in how the data is calculated, we've got you covered. There's already facts on that, and we're not going to do your homework for you. You got to do that yourself. But you'll be able to at least play with our data and see how changing the inputs changes the outputs. Next up, I've got salary info. I've been furiously trying to import the salary of players again back to 78, although data on how much players earned is actually kind of hard to find going back to 78. But where I could find it, I put it in. And so we're going to be able to start playing around with what I think are some very cool economics questions of, which players are the best bang for the buck and things like that. And if you were running a team, what contracts would you be trying to get? How much should you be trying to pay players of caliber X, et cetera? It's all going to be precursors to some stuff that we're probably going to be doing around fantasy basketball much, much later. And then finally, Arturo, the mad scientist of Boxscore Geeks, has come up with a proprietary metric that we call PMP. We're going to elaborate a little bit more on that in the future. We're going to probably gravitate a little bit away from wins produced and more towards PMP because I think it's a little more intuitive model. It's more based on kind of points per possession. And if I had player X instead of an average player, or if I had player X at this position, how many points plus or minus per possession or per 100 possessions or per 48 minutes should I expect to get out of that player in terms of efficiency differential? And that's exactly the kind of thing that helps us in a much more intuitive way see which players are overperforming at their position. Because I think it can be very hard to translate wins produced into that because if you're familiar with the network, with the metric, point 100 is average and point 200 is great, etc. But it's a lot more intuitive to have a metric that says, well, 0 is average and 1 is way above average. I want to differentiate this between wins produced, though, because a player whose point differential is 0 is still producing wins because a team full of people with a point differential of 0 would expect to win 41 games. That's all I got for upcoming features. Did that really live up to greatest feature of all time? I don't know if that really lived up to that.
I'm really excited. Some of that I knew about, some I didn't. It's going to be great.
So Brian's really excited. I don't know how anyone else here, and I got the feeling there weren't a lot of people who spilled their coffee in excitement listening to that particular announcement. But, it's the off season. We got to keep you interested somehow. So we're going to have new features rolling out for you over time in the next 6 to 8 weeks. That's about all I have to talk about today because I have an appointment to get to. Do you have anything you'd like to talk about at the end here, Brian?
Nothing at all. Great show, Patrick. Thanks for coming on and talking about all this stuff. I loved it.
Yes, thank you to our producer, Brian Foster. You got any shout outs, Brian?
I have none.
No shout outs.
No, I'm the anti-Dre. I don't thank anybody for anything.
So my shout out is going to be to Josh Weil for his it is Josh, right? Not Jonathan. I didn't screw this up. His great posts on the wages of wins this week covering the NCAA. I'm sorry, it's Jonathan Weiler. I'm a fool. Jonathan Weiler. Josh Weiler is another guy who's also in our group who also does some really cool stuff. So I'll give him a shout out too. But it's Jonathan Weiler that I wanted to give a shout out to for his really good stuff at ESPN Watch this week, which Dave has been reposting on our blog. Go check out Jonathan Weiler at ESPN Watch, theespnwatch.com. And I'll also give a big shout out to Arturo, who's been helping me a ton, getting all this historical data imported and helping me figure out how to tweak the metrics. And I should have brought this up. We're going to actually, another one of the upcoming features is that our wins produced numbers are going to get improved because I'm working on some algorithms that account for seconds played or minutes played at each position. So it's going to be a lot more intuitive to say, this player's going to play, 50% of his minutes at power forward and 50% at center and give him like a realistic wins produce as opposed to just sort of blindly assuming that players always play center or always play power forward or always play shooting guard and always play small forward. So we have, some statistical metrics that sort of figure out the balance of positions they play, and we are going to get a more accurate wins produced numbers for those players. Anyway, so that's my shout out to Arturo for helping me figure out this logic in my code so that our numbers are not just always Arturo digging around in an Excel spreadsheet to give you the newest and greatest. Instead, we're going to hopefully be able to build stuff directly out of our website's code. Those are my shout outs. Still got nothing, Brian? Did you get any chance to research some people?
No, I was trying to bring up the ESPN Watch during that time, and I did. Great site. So
okay.
No, so I got nothing. Take us out, Patrick.
Hopefully, get a shout out in the show notes for ESPN Watch. Really good stuff. I think I like his stuff a lot. And I have nothing else, so I'm just going to thank everybody for watching, and we'll see you hopefully with more people next week.